talked about how societies can be defined by their economies. I just can't help but say this, but I had a student halfway through class last time saying, like, well, what does economy have to do with social problems? And hopefully after last class, it's pretty clear. Economy is our lives. It's our jobs. It's where we work. There's all kinds of problems, involved with the economy. Of course, there's problems of culture, problems of institutions. But now we get to new material, and we start to look at global economy in a little more detail. Kind of a lot of material tonight, but some of it we can buzz over and just to focus on main ideas like we've done before. Anyway, okay, all that stuff said. We can define societies by their economy, by their culture, by their institutions. We'll see all that tonight. New idea. Here is that with globalization, economies around the world are increasingly interdependent. So, I know a lot of us already know this. It's increasingly more and more obvious, and hopefully you guys had some fun with that assignment from last time, looking for applications, at least digging around for applications, if nothing else. Hopefully that was fun. So yeah, economies, increasingly interdependent. Jobs here are affected by things that are going on all over the world. So that's the point. Interdependent and increasingly locked into or dependent on the global economy and what's going on with the global economy. Okay, so with that said, let's transition now to a snapshot of wealth around the world. Here's our header, global economy, and we'll think about this question: where's the wealth? I know most of us already know this true. Generally, that's all we're going for here, generalities. But who's got wealth? Who doesn't have wealth around the world? We'll see some trends though here and some patterns that may be not as clear without a graphic display like this one. Okay, so let's just look around the world here a bit. Now this is a map of wealth in terms of gross national income, which is not gross domestic product. The difference is gross domestic income is how much your average person makes. That's their income, their average income. Like in the U.S., average incomes are what is it from? Average is, it's going to be, I don't know, around 40, maybe. I'm not sure the exact number. I know poverty is $23,000 today. And if you're less than $23,000 a year, you're in the poverty. But average is going to be somewhere in the 40s. Of course, the high ends are, hundreds of thousands, and so on. Anyway, United States, by the typical income, most people are going to be making, even in poverty, if you have a job, part-time or not, around $10,000 or more a year. That's not a lot of money at all. But that's the low end of the high-income countries. Okay, so the lower middle, here we've got Brazil, the lowest, the poorest countries. Surprisingly, there's not a lot of blue here, this lowest bracket of $800 or less a year. A lot more of this green now, and even yellow with Mexico. Mexico's now moving up to the upper middle in terms of average person's income. So a lot of orange here in the United States, Canada, wealthy nations. A lot of orange here in Western Europe. Of course, the UK, even Ireland here, of course Scandinavia, we'll see Spain, are all considered high-income nations. Western Africa, though, we see more green, and then we start to see blue. These blocks of blue where we're talking about great poverty. Got some of that. Years in the past, we would have saw more blue through here, but surprisingly a lot of green there in this lower middle bracket. Okay, Eastern Hemisphere, we see a lot more blue here. The rest of Africa, all through here, the rest of Central Asia here, and of course India. China is interesting because last time we looked at China and how it's growing as an economy. In terms of gross domestic product, how much stuff they're putting out into the world, they're like 3, I think. They're right behind Germany, I think now, if I'm not mistaken. In terms of, they're putting a lot of stuff out into the world. But the average person's income is still not as high. There is, more and more of a growing middle class here in China, but still the average income is somewhere in the middle. Okay, Australia is wealthy, Japan is wealthy, Saudi Arabia is wealthy there, and Kuwait are wealthy, and the United Arab Emirates is quite wealthy there too. Okay, so that's a snapshot of wealth. Again, you see the patterns. Where's most of the wealth, generally? North or south? More north, right? And more in the Western world, Western Europe and so on. Okay, so characteristics, richest and poorest. So the richest nations, or developed nations, by and large, have industrialized at some point in their history. And that's the key theme we're going to look at today, this idea of modernization, development, industrialization. Okay. Increasingly post-industrial, though, their economies are. We talked about that. We'll get into that a little more detail tonight, too. Poorest nations, the greens and the yellows, predominantly agricultural and unindustrialized. They've never really gone through the same stages of development or industrialization. Their ways of life, are based on farming and basic stuff to mouth kind of existence, or stuff to survival. Okay, again, richest tends to be the Western world, the North, the global North. We saw those patterns. The richest nations also typically have more stable governments, just as a general, example. Like one's criticize and criticize our government and other, wealthy governments, but typically they're stable democracies. They've been democracies for a while, and they're not going anywhere. They're stable, they're solid, they have strong defense, and so on. Poorest nations, along with being dependent, on basic agriculture, typically are more unstable. You see a lot more unrest, and you see whole governments being overthrown, and so on. So you see the two tend to go hand in hand: democracy and development. Okay, again, non-Western world, global South. Tonight we'll talk about why, why questions, theories why some are poor, some are rich, and why certain countries developed in the first place. But before we get there, let's look next at some general themes here, along with the development of the rich nations, the powerful nations. Rich is powerful. We can be clear about that too, other than maybe a few exceptions. Okay, so along with this, transition or this long history to modern industrial societies, we can also talk about debates over wealth and inequalities. Who should own what, and how much should private individuals own? Again, communist countries, thought it was wrong for an individual like Sam Walton to be a billionaire. They just thought that was principally wrong for one person. That should be, society's wealth. And like an industry like oil should never be owned by a single individual, because it's how can you say oil belongs to an individual? It should be the nation's oil. Just as general principles, generalities. Okay, so again, greater independence. We talked about that. Less self-sufficiency. More or less, most nations like the U.S. are locked into. Maybe that's a strong way to put it, but we're pretty much locked into the global economy now. We saw that last time with our dependence on China, producing most of our stuff. It used to be fun to play the game of looking at where stuff is made. It's all made in China. Look at our clothes. It's almost all China or Taiwan or Southeast Asia, predominantly, our clothing, at least. Okay, so greater reliance on technology. We talked about that. And then these debates, again, over environment, sustainability, just general concerns here. A lot of our, topics for social problems right here. Okay, and then rates of social change will increase too. at some of the disparities here next. In terms of rich and poor, we'll just look at a few general indicators of haves and have-nots here globally. So that's where we're going to turn next. Is that good? Increased rates of social change, that's the last one. Okay, so, all good. Okay, so global disparities. Here, don't worry about the details so much. Here, well, no, actually, this first one, I'm sorry. This first one, do worry about the details, and I'll go slower here. Okay, 2 indicators of disparities or inequalities between the haves and have-nots in terms of countries. This is UN data, 2006. No major changes. It's a little bit older. You know, this is 6 years old now, or 7. But no major changes. Just the general theme here. Kind of striking that the richest 2% of people in the world own half of the world's overall wealth. It seems impossible, maybe incomprehensible, but we only need to think of a couple outliers, like a Bill Gates, or let's see, T. Boone Pickens, or some of the great, oil barons and those families that are still around today, like the Rockefellers. They still have great wealth too, and some of these other long-standing families. But it's really going to be the outliers that are going to be, making this number more real. So yeah, we're talking about people who own major industries, major oil, in the old days, big steel, or some sort of major utility, some sort of major good that all the world needs, like oil. Okay, so 50% of the world's wealth. Here, when we talk about the average person's wealth again, how much stuff the average person owns, most of the world's wealth, when it comes down to stuff, is owned by people either in North America, Western Europe, or Japan. Again, the wealthiest nations that we saw on our map. So of course, outliers like the oil barons in the Middle East are going to be excluded from that. We're talking about the average person's cars and TVs and just stuff that we all own. Okay, so those are 2 indicators of extremes. Yeah. We're going to look at extremes coming from another text. There, Coleman and Kerbo. All right, here we go for just general patterns. I'm just going to list the pattern here, and you'll see the main idea. When it comes to global disparities and life expectancy and things like the number of children dying before the age of 5, a general indicator of standard of living, here, rich nations, middle, and poor. What do we see? From the 1970s to now, the numbers for all 3 countries have come down. So, standards of living have definitely gone up everywhere across the world. I think that's pretty safe to say. So, seems like a good trend. Life is getting better. There's an article by that name. I think makes some sense. Health, medicine, all that stuff. Okay, but we can look at now comparison between poor nations and rich nations here, roughly, today, and we still see quite a disparity, 7 to 113. Again, children dying before the age of 5 per 1,000. So, relatively low, still pretty high, I would think, by our standards at least. Okay, so that's just one general trend. Another one, now we get to life expectancy. Here too, life expectancy's gone up everywhere, but between rich and poor, there's still a 20-year difference. There's a lot of other factors we could weigh in there, but point is, live in a poor nation, life expectancy is 60 years old. Again, this rich, middle, poor is characterized by either gross domestic income or some other indicator of overall wealth. So, 20-year difference, rich and poor. Okay, so that's the point. Okay, so we can move on to that one here. Point made. general trends here. So again, wealth obviously matters when it comes to standards of living and life expectancy, how people live and how long they live. It also matters when it comes to health and nutrition. In the poorest nations, as we might expect, and we're going to see some of that here later just in a short clip in a bit, but lack of basic necessities is still a reality for large numbers of people across the world. So that's the first one. Talk about access to doctors, and hopefully we've got a rough sense of that. That's just a reality. Clean water, medicine, all those things are in shortage in the poorest nations. Education, also, 1 in 3 in less developed countries cannot read or write, which just by our standards, once again, just seems incomprehensible. And that's today. That's still today. So 1/3 of the population not being able to read or write is considerable in these poorest nations. When it comes to women and children, this source I'm looking at makes an interesting point about how in the United States, what's the goal? Equality or inequality for all people? It's equality, right, of all people, no matter gender, race, whatever. That's our goal at least. We don't live up to it, but that's the goal. The book makes the point that in certain parts of the world, culturally, it's not even the goal. It's still not even something to strive for. And we can get into that and look at examples, during debates and so on, but an interesting difference between the richest and the poorest. And there's, of course, a lot of culture and politics wrapped up in there too. Okay, lastly here with this slide, another interesting difference comes down to how the societies are put together, or the composition of the rich and the poor. In the West here, we can say there's a larger middle class. America's always been built on the middle class, right? Okay, non-Western world, poorest nations, lack of a middle class. In some cases, no middle class. Just a much greater split between the rich people and the poor people. The very wealthy and then the people at the bottom. So, greater division between the rich and the poor. Okay, so that's another interesting difference between Western societies and non-Western and the poorest. Okay, so all those points made, I think that stuff's straightforward enough. We've got a rough sense of that already, I think, around the world, looking around the world. All right, so let's get into looking at the global economy again. And this was the old model that we talked about. I'm just going to list it. Oops, you've already got this. We already did this last time. Talked about first world nations. Those are the rich, powerful capitalist nations back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And then there were the second world nations. Those are the communist nations, led by Russia, Soviet Union, the USSR. And then China was down with that. East Germany was a part of this communist bloc. Cuba, North Korea, all communist nations. So we had the first world and the second world, the Cold War between the two, and then you had the third world, which in a lot of cases, one or the other were trying to get them on board with them, and trying to, in some cases, we'll see, get the good stuff that they've got into one or two of their systems. Anyway, that model doesn't work anymore for explaining the world. It's really past its ability to explain things. How and why? Okay, so we can go to what we looked at last time with Walmart, and just the general fact that our economy here, number 2, let me go that one first. Our economies change. Basically, what we saw, how we've lost a lot of industrial jobs. We're talking about number 2 here, the economic restructuring, as sometimes they call it. The nice way to say we lost a bunch of jobs. bunch of manufacturing jobs to China, Mexico, and other parts of the world. The idea of making clothes here in the United States is, it's going to be very niche products and high-end. You're not your basic consumer goods, or none of that stuff's made here. No electronics, essentially. Maybe niche electronics. All of it's made somewhere else now. So that's number 2 here. So that's part of this broader change. Outsourcing. Okay, number 1, that's what we looked at earlier. The communist world has changed. They're open to buying and selling and trading, free markets, and China likes doing business with us, obviously. Even Russia, even though we have our disputes with them, we'll do business. Businesses will back and forth. Russia's growing now again, and well, it's gone through ups and downs. Anyway, all right. So these are the 2 reasons that model of the Cold War no longer fits. Political changes here, communist world, changes in our economy, moving to more towards a service economy, less manufacturing. Okay, all that stuff said, this contributes to here and leads to